All right.
Good to go?
Good to go.
Okay. So thanks everyone for coming today. What I'm talking about today is what I've titled the homelessness state of emergency. So my research more broadly, and in terms of my PhD research, is focusing on kind of the interaction between the constitutional protection of social rights and public trust in government. But I became really interested in this kind of sort of case study or a small subsection of it. So I got interested in kind of this what I'm going to describe as a recent trend in kind of dealing with homelessness. So to start off, I just wanted to say kind of it's very much a work in progress. So be gentle. I know there's a lot of things that need to be worked out, and I would love your feedback and comments and ideas. So like I said, my talk today is dealing with a very recent trend, and that trend is basically local levels of government, specifically in the United States, but there's been a push for places outside of the United States to declare a state of emergency in respect of homelessness. So as I'm sure many of you or all of you are aware, homelessness is a growing problem on a global level. Cities around the world are dealing with kind of what they describe as a homelessness crisis. The numbers are getting kind of out of hand. And some of these, certain American cities have taken this step to declare kind of a state of emergency on homelessness, which is kind of a novel step because it's not something that we usually associate with the state of emergency. And what I particularly found interesting is, or what I thought was that this trend appears to be based on an assumption that, particularly held by human rights activists and held by politicians, that declaring such a state of emergency on homelessness will actually benefit homeless people, that it'll actually, deal with kind of problems around homelessness, allow for example, establishing more affordable housing or establishing more room in temporary shelters, which is obviously a very positive thing. But today what I wanted to talk about is kind of challenge that assumption. And specifically, I want to look at this trend and determine whether or not this assumption, and particularly I want to suggest that maybe if we look at the state of emergency as applied to the homelessness context, that it can actually be problematic from a human rights perspective, and particularly with respect to the right to housing. So essentially, my working thesis is that by declaring a state of emergency, a local level of government doesn't hand, i.e., kind of noting that there is a crisis and that it needs to be dealt with. It also triggers what has been described as an emergency response paradigm, and through that paradigm, government, that local level of government, through its institutions and its officials, is supposed to tackle the crisis. And while undoubtedly this emergency response paradigm in the homelessness crisis can help and kind of promote human rights and can promote the right to housing, I'm going to argue or suggest that what it can actually do is introduce regressive measures. And in particular, I want to focus on one particular type of regressive measure, and that's what's been described as the criminalization of homelessness. And it's a term that I'll describe very shortly.
So sorry.
No problem. So my ultimate take-home message is that, for those human rights activists and politicians who are looking to the state of emergency as a promising means of realizing housing and actually benefiting homeless people, they should weigh this cost against any potential benefits that they think it may ultimately have. So kind of in going through today's presentation, I'm going to go through 2 parts. The first part is I'm just going to give a basic overview of kind of homelessness at a glance. I can't go into statistics or anything of that sort, but just kind of give you an idea of kind of how the problem is and where this kind of idea of declaring a state of emergency on homelessness has come from. Then second, I want to deal with the issue of why declare a state of emergency. So why have people thought that it would be beneficial? And then the final third part, which is the core of the argument, which is problematizing this homelessness state of emergency. So like I said, homelessness is on the rise globally, and 2017 has witnessed what some have called unprecedented levels. And so we're ultimately dealing with what some have called a homelessness crisis. And so the first place that actually started this trend was Los Angeles. And in 2015, they declared a state of emergency on homelessness. And just to give you their numbers, between 2013 and 2015, their homelessness rate increased by 12%. And that makes it that in Los Angeles County, there's 45,000 homeless people. And in the city proper, there's 25,000 homeless people. And so obviously there's going to be disagreement about how you calculate who is homeless, who's not homeless. But just to give you kind of an idea of the magnitude of the problem that we're dealing with. And so while LA was the first kind of city to declare such a state of emergency, a number of cities since 2015 have followed suit. So we have, for example, Seattle, Portland, Anaheim, and the entire state of Hawaii actually declared a state of emergency on homelessness. And the reason I got particularly interested in this as well is that my hometown of Toronto, there's been a kind of call for the city to declare a state of emergency on homelessness, and as well as certain cities in the UK. So it's not just an American phenomenon. There's, you know, kind of, it has relevance to the wider kind of world. So now the question is, so why should we declare a state of emergency? Why do we think that it has any benefit? Well, there are three principal benefits that people put forward to justify why it's actually helpful. The first is kind of what you would normally think of when dealing with the state of emergency, and that's that it grants governments additional powers. So at a local level, it gives these local actors, these local bodies, through various emergency statutes, depending on the jurisdiction, but a range of powers. And those powers would be to authorize necessary action, to control the location of individuals, to use property and to control resources, to require that certain services be provided, and kind of problematic, or more than kind of problematic, to search, arrest, and to fine. And so in a homelessness context, these powers can be and have been used to open more temporary shelters, to expand various services that are available to homeless people, and to create more safe places for those who are sleeping, quote unquote, rough, which means sleeping in the streets. So, and used in this way, obviously, it has beneficial effects. The second benefit, in addition to these, granting these additional powers, is that it garners support from higher levels of government. So a number of individuals have put forward this idea that homelessness is not a local problem. It may kind of, people want to, attribute it to or focus on the local level. But for example, in the United States, it's very much a national problem. And so by declaring a state of emergency, you garner, or ultimately draw attention to those higher levels of government and hopefully gain both financial support and other forms of support from those higher levels of government. And then the third, and related to that, is to raise public awareness. So by declaring a state of emergency, you're more likely to get news coverage on the particular issue. And by attaching a label like emergency to homelessness, it grabs, or should grab, the public's attention. And so those three things kind of put together, allows for the state of emergency to be seen in a positive way, and therefore something that hopefully could help dealing with homelessness. Now, for the remainder of the time that I want to talk about what I call the cons of declaring a state of emergency, or problematizing this idea. So I want to suggest that the state of emergency, when applied to homelessness, can actually undercut the right to housing. And it can do so because of a combination of two things. Those two things are, one, what I will describe as the three conceptual underpinnings for the emergency response paradigm. So this idea of this response that governments are kind of empowered to engage in, it's premised on three kind of underpinnings, and those are well established in the emergency literature, and that's this idea of a threat or danger. So the government or the state actors are responding to a threat or danger. This idea of necessity, that it's the action that is being undertaken is that which is necessary and therefore necessary. And then finally, this idea of a division or separation between normalcy and kind of extreme or emergency. And so the idea here is that you want to, the goal of the state should ultimately be to return to this state of normalcy. And then the second kind of thing that I ultimately suggesting that combined with these three conceptual underpinnings that's problematic is what I'll describe as the political backdrop for a homelessness state of emergency. And I'll get into that in just a second. But ultimately, what I want to suggest is that when you combine these two things together, what you're essentially doing is that you're forcing kind of homelessness and homelessness crises into a state of emergency legal framework, which understandably was not a framework that it was envisioned for. And it creates two problems. One is that it essentially offers state actors a platform, a legal platform, from which they can introduce regressive measures, including the criminalization measures that I alluded to earlier. And second, what it does is, and tying into what a number of emergency scholars have talked about, is this idea of establishing a permanent state of emergency. And so what it ultimately does is, taken together, if we can use if the state of emergency can be used to introduce regressive measures, and then that state of emergency is ultimately seen as something of a permanent nature, those regressive measures become at least very long-standing, if not permanent. And so obviously those two things put together are problematic from a human rights perspective. So what do I mean by the political backdrop for a homelessness state of emergency? Well, I mean two things. One is that when we're dealing with homelessness and low-income citizens, there's a number of what I will describe as misguided assumptions. And these misguided assumptions are not only held by the public, but held by state actors, and therefore make their way into kind of policy, and they're ultimately what policy is based on. The first is what I'll describe as the assumption of choice. And it's the idea that homeless people are homeless because they choose to be homeless. This assumption is fundamentally incorrect, or at least significantly oversimplified. The empirical research establishes that this assumption is incorrect, but nonetheless it persists. And there's a number of reasons why people have suggested that it persists, but it does persist. And the problem here is that not only is it misguided, but what it does is, because we assume that homeless people are homeless by choice, it promotes this idea of criminalizing homelessness. So now, let me explain what I mean by criminalizing homelessness. The criminalization of homelessness essentially refers to the use of policing and the criminal justice system as a first form of response when dealing with visible homelessness. So rather than focusing on affordable housing or focusing on shelter spaces, we focus on essentially prohibiting and attaching fines to things associated with visible homelessness. So what are described as life-sustaining activities in the public space. So those include things like sleeping in public spaces, sitting in public spaces, urinating in public spaces, defecating in public spaces, and seeking income in various ways in public spaces. And so the reason why I suggest that the assumption of choice promotes these kind of measures, these criminalization measures, is that rather than homeless people being viewed as victims of kind of structural problems like a lack of affordable housing or the unavailability of decent employment, they're essentially viewed as quote unquote bad people who have made bad choices. And because we see it as a question of choice, therefore we feel justified in criminalizing certain behaviors. Now, in addition to kind of the difficulties that are associated with this, such measures are especially problematic because what they ultimately do is they perpetuate homelessness. Because if we attach a fine to an individual for doing things that they have no choice but to do in public spaces, that fine, when it's not paid, which it most likely will not be given their circumstances, escalates into more serious offenses, which then leads to a criminal record, which then leads to more difficulty in terms of getting the benefits that they need in order to get themselves out of the situation at hand. So it's just, you essentially create a vicious cycle of homelessness. The second assumption that I want to deal with, in addition to this assumption of choice, is the assumption of dangerousness. And the idea here is that homeless people are somehow dangerous to the public, or to the public outside of the homeless public. And this assumption has been argued to stem in large part from the fact that when we witness human struggle and desperation, it provokes fear in us. This fear then leads to kind of a natural instinct to kind of seek our protection, and then it further kind of exacerbating the problem dealing with the criminalization of homelessness, we turn to the police and the criminal justice system in order for that protection, which then in turn creates more problems in terms of homelessness. And so, obviously there are certain, like any member of the population, there are individuals who are homeless who may be dangerous, but what's ultimately wrong here is we shouldn't assume that homeless people as a population are somehow dangerous, whereas it's no more so than anybody else. So those two assumptions are the first kind of element of what I'll describe as the political backdrop for the homelessness state of emergency. The second is what I will describe as crisis politics. And the idea here is that when you're dealing with a crisis, there's a body of literature that establishes that crises produce what's been described as a dislocation or a delegitimation of the pre-existing socio-political order. So what they essentially do is crises open up political space for actors inside government and outside government to redefine issues, to propose policy innovations and organizational reforms, to gain popularity, and potentially to strike at opponents. And this leads to what has been described as a framing contest, wherein these actors essentially try to frame the crisis, what caused the crisis, what its severity is, who's responsible for the crisis and its implications. And everybody's trying to get their frame accepted by the public at large. And potentially they can exploit this opportunity and exploit the crisis in order to gain credibility with the public. Now, when you're dealing with a homelessness crisis, understandably, human rights activists will frame the crisis in terms of government failure. So it's a problem of structural problems. It allows, and the reason why is understandably, it allows them to challenge existing policies on employment, welfare, and housing. But state actors, depending on the situation, but are most likely not going to adopt that frame. And they're much more incentivized to adopt the frame of kind of what's been described as the individualist approach or view of homelessness. And that is attributing homelessness to individual character flaws, bad choices, tying it into the assumption of choice, alcoholism, mental disease. And so it's not a problem of the state, it's not a structural problem, it's an individual problem. And so I think it makes sense that this then allows them to kind of deflect the blame away from them, put the blame on those outside of, those potentially the homeless, or at least kind of the surrounding environment. But then again, it can feed into this issue or this problem of criminalization of homelessness. So with that backdrop established, I want to get into those three conceptual underpinnings of the homelessness or the state of emergency and why I think that it's problematic. So the first, what I've described as the first conceptual underpinning is this idea of threat or danger. So the idea in a state of emergency, the state is essentially responding to some threat or danger that it needs to deal with. But the problem is that when you're dealing with a homelessness crisis, unlike some other emergencies, take for example a natural disaster, the nature of that threat or danger and the target of the threat or danger is extremely ambiguous. So if we think of something like, and not to say that there's not complications with other types of disasters or crises, but just kind of, we want to look at a comparison. So something like a forest fire, the way at least I see it is that we can, on some objective basis, we can establish what exactly is the threat or danger. We can see it as kind of, attributing it to the spreading of the fire to some sort of inhabited area, and then that will lead to the harm to people and to property. And then the target of that threat or danger is arguably the people who live in that inhabited area. But when you're dealing with homelessness, what exactly is the threat or danger that we're dealing with? Now, we could define it as homelessness itself, that. So are we trying to eradicate homelessness? Are we dealing with some sort of consequence of homelessness? So for example, some have focused on the health implications. Is there a particular outbreak of a certain disease among the homeless population? Is it the death toll that's associated with homelessness? Or is it some factor that's tied to homelessness? So is it the lack of shelter space? So if we have everybody in shelters, is that enough? Have we eliminated the threat or danger? Do we have to go further? Is it adequate permanent housing? So the threat or danger is highly ambiguous. But then the question of target is, I think, even more problematic, because on one level, we can define the target of the threat or danger as, so let's assume that we define the nature of the threat or danger as the fact of homelessness itself. We'll keep it very broad. The target of that threat or danger could, and I would say should, be those who are experiencing homelessness. So the problem is that those who are experiencing homelessness are in a dire situation that the state needs to respond to. But we could also argue, or it could also be argued that the target of the threat or danger is those who are not homeless, those who are property owners or business owners who see homelessness as some sort of blight or problem that's impacting their interests. And when we tie that in with the previous assumptions, the assumption of dangerousness and the assumption of choice, we can see how the argument can be made that the threat or danger and the target of that threat or danger, the target is the non-homeless, the nature of the threat or danger is homelessness, and so the interest that we're trying to protect is the non-homeless. And so essentially what I'm trying to argue is that the ambiguity that exists here in both how we define the nature of the threat or danger, but also the ambiguity around its target, when we couple that with the political backdrop that I set out earlier, it makes regressive measures like the criminalization of homelessness all the more likely, or at least it lends them considerable strength, because it's creating this legal framework where those assumptions can be furthered, and where the language being highly ambiguous, and frankly the language of threat or danger being problematic in and of itself, it could push us in that direction. In addition to that, the ambiguous nature of the threat or danger and its target, the other issue dealing with the threat or danger is the idea of urgency. So it's generally understood that emergencies are built on an element of urgency. And generally the reason why this urgency comes up is that emergencies are seen as something that's unforeseen and sudden, and coupled with the magnitude of the emergency or of the issue, we need an urgent response. But the problem with this is that Jonathan White has used the term, but essentially what emergencies do is they make, quote unquote, a virtue of haste. So haste and hasty government or state decision-making is seen as a positive. They turn hasty decision makers by state actors, normally viewed with suspicion, into something to which we should actually aspire. It's anything that stands in the way of hasty decision making is somehow problematic and something to be discouraged. And so what White has argued is that essentially what emergencies do is they delegitimize dissent and they undercut public debate on decisions of lasting consequence. Now, on a very general level, such undercutting of is problematic. We shouldn't. Public debate is important, but there's the flip side, which is argued that we need to be able to respond quickly because we're dealing with an emergency. But what's particularly problematic is when we're dealing with a situation like homelessness and a crisis like homelessness, is that we already start off with, and the social rights literature is full of references to this and arguments and empirical research to support it. But the idea that essentially those who are low-income citizens, and homeless people probably being the worst of that situation, they lack political influence. So their interests are significantly underrepresented, if represented at all, in the political process. And so by removing public debate and removing this, encouraging hasty decision-making, you're essentially removing that, and so what people have argued with respect to social rights is that the fundamental core of social rights should be increased participation, that we need to encourage more participation from those low-income citizens to be able to ensure that their interests are being adequately represented. But what the state of emergency does is that rather than, moving in that direction, we're actually moving in the opposite direction and further undercutting any voice that they may have, if they had any voice at all. We're getting rid of it even further. Now, why this is additionally problematic is that a homelessness crisis, unlike some other crises, remember that the justification for the idea of urgency was the idea that this crisis is unforeseen and sudden. But a homelessness crisis, and I can be proven wrong, but really can't be justified as either unforeseen or sudden. And the argument's been made time and time again that the homelessness crisis that cities and countries globally are facing are the product of years, if not decades, of policies that have been made dealing with welfare, housing, social support, various aspects. And so to describe it as sudden or unforeseen is not really accurate. And so it's really only urgent because the relevant state actors have decided to call it urgent. But there's nothing which objectively makes it more urgent today than it was yesterday or in 2 months' time. The only, at least to my mind, what can be seen as making it more urgent is weather conditions. And I would suggest that if weather conditions, like, for example, freezing cold temperatures, if that is the concern, then that should be the threat or danger. That should be the nature of the emergency. And so we should use that element to define the emergency at issue. And I can talk about that in more detail if people have questions. But so if we accept that in fact the homelessness crises really aren't sudden or unforeseen, and therefore there isn't really have a very good justification for saying that we need to act hastily and we need to undercut or basically forego this kind of public debate. And so what, coupled with what I said earlier, essentially what you're doing is you're creating opportunities for state actors, should they so choose, to push through these criminalization measures quickly and without public debate. And that is highly problematic. The second conceptual underpinning for the emergency response paradigm that I want to talk about very briefly is this idea of necessity. And so the idea here is that, remember what I said, that when you're dealing with an emergency, the state actors are given powers to do what is quote unquote necessary. And so it's seen as, and so what people have argued, quite rightly, I think, is that because of that idea, whatever is done by the state in response to the emergency ultimately takes on this idea of necessity, that it's somehow becomes seen as objectively necessary and justifiable as necessary after the fact. So Alan Green, for example, has called this, cloaking the emergency response with a quote unquote veil of objectivity. And he's argued that basically the idea here is that the rhetoric of emergency establishes the lens or the frame for the debate around the crisis, and that includes how the state responds to the crisis. And so applying this to the homelessness crisis, what I'm suggesting is that the measures that I've referred to, this idea of criminalizing homelessness, once they've been pushed through, if we accept that they may be pushed through, given the urgency and given the ambiguity by which we define the threat or danger and its target, then we have this problem that the measures can then be justified as objectively necessary, given kind of that dynamic or that. Sorry. Okay. Sorry. Sorry.
Wow.
It's an emergency.
It was almost
Nothing happened.
I was thinking, Deborah, now we have an help.
I was thinking here.
Anyways, I'm sorry. No worries. yeah, so essentially what I wanted to suggest is that, or the way I see it, and is that once we've if we accept that the urgency element, leads to, or can potentially lead to this idea that these criminalization measures can be pushed through quickly, then after the fact, they can be justified as necessary given this kind of veil of objectivity. And then the final element, or final kind of conceptual underpinning, this idea of normalcy. And many people kind of at this center have dealt with this issue, the idea that the emergency response paradigm being built on the assumption of a separation between emergency and normalcy, and the aim of state actors being to restore normalcy. And then we ultimately, there's the problem of kind of a permanent, quote unquote, permanent state of emergency. But with a homelessness crisis, there's two problems that have been raised in respect of other crises, but with respect to homelessness, I'm going to just flesh it out a bit. But one is that, how do we define normalcy? So it ultimately suggests that there's somehow an acceptable level of homelessness. So is it that it was, a certain number of homeless people is acceptable? What is that number? How do we define that number? It's really unclear and problematic, I would suggest, from a human rights perspective. But the second, that even if we can somehow define normalcy, the issue is, do we really want that normalcy? Because as has been argued for other crises like economic crises, the policies that have led to the emergency that we're dealing with, the emergency on homelessness, is arguably responsible for that emergency. Those policies, so we don't want to return to the status quo. We need to kind of change the status quo. And so this ultimately creates an opportunity, or opens up a landscape for this idea of this permanent state of emergency. And so what does it mean from a homelessness perspective, or dealing with criminalization measures? Well, it essentially means that those criminalization measures, if they're pushed through quickly and justified after the fact as necessary, they can arguably become a permanent fixture, given this kind of idea that we're not trying to implement them in order to restore some sort of level of normalcy, or to get to some sort of status quo, but it's essentially the way we are dealing with homelessness. So kind of those are my preliminary thoughts on this, and then, like I said, I'm still working through, but open to questions, comments. Yeah.
Just general comment or something to think about. I'm writing an article about the emergency regulation on housing in Israel, and it's something that I'm thinking about at the moment. But I think there is something different about housing than other fields, because when it comes to other cases or fields or areas or occasions or disasters, the governments executing emergency response, as you call it.
Mm-hmm.
There is it's more suitable than in housing, because housing takes time. And I think more than other fields. Like if you want to do a reform or a serious regulation or a serious change in policy in housings, particularly, it takes at least 4, 5, 6, 7 years before you see results, simply because it takes time to build houses and to find housing solutions. So I think when we're looking at emergency response, there is something different, very different about housing. And you mentioned 3 justifications or 3 reasons for declaring emergencies. And I would add a 4th, which is it's not only the public awareness, and it's not only government authorities, and it's not only the ability to get, like in the US, federal recognition. There's a 4th element, I think, that justifies particularly emergency response, which is time and an ability to, or a necessity to respond in short time or immediately. And it doesn't work for housing. There should be relevancy for, there are many things that you can do in housing when you want to do a reform to solve a problem. And emergency is one of them. But I'm not sure it's justified because of the particular characteristics of this field of housing. It takes 7 years.
What it did in terms of housing was these Vitale, these quick committees, these committees that you don't have to go through the regular planning processes, which actually does what Jonathan White talked about, because it eliminates any debate on decisions about these processes.
Yeah.
So in a way, it kind of it in some ways it's a parallel to your. I mean, it's a good parallel that you're bringing housing and homelessness, because some of the dangers are similar.
Like it's definitely a positive in the sense that
Well, it's a negative as well.
well, it's a negative,
Negative as
but
well.
the positive element is the idea is that you can kind of, and that's part of what I meant in terms of adding the additional
Right.
powers, is that you essentially cut through bureaucratic red tape and you get, you can avoid certain kind of delays in the process,
Okay.
Yeah.
assuming that you're trying.
into your
Yeah.
So it's important to distinguish between if you want to exploit resources that you already have, like public housing, like there are empty buildings and you want to put people in, or when you need to build them. And that's two completely
Yeah,
different
fair.
cases. And in cities like,
Well, but it also depends on how, like when you're dealing with housing, or depends on how you define kind of the homelessness emergency. So if you're defining it in terms of, and you're focusing on street homelessness and shelters, then all you're doing is trying to create shelter spaces, and you're not actually trying to get at the affordable housing that takes the time, so that kind of ties in.
there is a lot of writing about this particular distinguish, and you were talking about LA. So it's one case if you're talking about a really crowded city and there are 40,000 people that there's nowhere to put them. So it's either you move them or you build new houses, or cities that have resources but they're too expensive or they're whatever. So I think it's an important thing to
I just have a question. Did Giuliano, when he cleaned up the homeless in New York, did he use emergency powers, or did he not?
Not to, I don't believe so. There's the stuff that I've kind of talked about is, and it's part of there's a lot of issue around why West Coast cities are seen, because most of the cities that have declared states of emergency are on the West Coast, and there's people are raise questions about why that is the case, because it's not that actually the West Coast cities, the numbers are worse.
I wonder what laws Giuliano used to. I mean, he basically institutionalized. I don't remember the numbers. It was a decade ago.
partly regulation.
Or something. I wonder.
Right.
Yeah.
But some of the kind of arguments that have been made about why kind of there's issues on the West Coast is that there's been certain cities on the East Coast have sent their homeless populations to the West Coast.
Well, Giuliani sent them to
He
State
sent them
Island,
to state.
right?
He sent them to state institutions, psychiatric institutions.
But
I mean, within like months.
Maybe we should go around the
Yes,
table,
sorry.
so it's nice.
Let's start with you. No, with you.
Okay, thank you. So I have to preface by saying that I only was able to glance at the article, so I may be asking questions that are addressed in the text.
yeah, no worries.
So first, I think as at first thought, I really kind of seems everything you say seems right, and I think it also connects with an existing literature. My own field is international law, which is a little different, but there is also a kind of fruitful area of coming out of, I guess, Hillary Charlesworth's article in the 90s. You may or may not be familiar, who wrote about internationalized the discipline of crisis. And there she argues that this orientation towards crisis or towards emergency has a systematic effect of making lawyers oversee structural problems such as income inequality, global inequality in general, environmental issues, et cetera, et cetera. So it makes us think of things as happening dramatically and urgently, where they are actually rooted in slow processes that are much more, are really related to material inequalities in the bottom line. So it seems to be kind of going in the same general direction. However, I also think that I'm not entirely convinced by the argument as I heard it here in the following sense. It seems to me that emergencies with regard to homelessness can be progressive or regressive. They largely depends on political circumstances. Maybe we are living through a moment in which political circumstances are such that it's easier or more, there's a greater tendency towards regressive states of emergency, but we can remember other historical moments in which there were progressive states of emergency. I guess the most famous example is FDR. And I don't really understand why we cannot think of a progressive state of emergency with regard to homelessness in terms of generating more funds for giving people housing, healthcare, food. It's all providing what people need quickly in terms of budgets, if the political will is there. So it doesn't seem like a problem with the measure of the state of emergency, but rather just a more general problem of neoliberal politics that pervades both the emergency context and the non-emergency context, especially when, as you say, in the deliberative democracy argument that you provide, homeless people, already have no voice. So it seems like, protecting their voice in deliberative democracy processes is not the right response because they do not have voice in that context. So yeah, I guess that's the thought.
Oh, just to respond. No, I agree with you. I think that, and part of what I'm trying to do is, that's why I described it as kind of problematizing the state of emergency.
Mm-hmm.
Just, it's not that I'm saying that it will lead to or is necessarily a bad thing. It's just that I think the assumption that it will necessarily lead to a good thing is problematic, and we have to kind of be aware of the way.
But are there many sophisticated commentators that think that it's necessarily good?
There's honestly not been very much commentary at all.
Okay.
But it's just in terms of the descriptions that are in terms of kind of this push in kind of the media and people advocating that it be used. I think that we just need to be weary of kind of not being aware of its kind of downsides or its dangers. So I'm just, and like you said, there's a wealth of kind of emergency literature, and I think that if we're going to take kind of this idea and transplant it onto homelessness, we have to be aware of kind of those dangers that are in that literature that makes it been applied to things like national security, natural disasters, but haven't been applied to kind of this issue of homelessness.
Would you like to answer?
Panel conversation. I have no question. Yeah.
I don't want to ask, but it's a little interesting for me because in Hungary there is a problem too for I think so all the world is problem. But in Hungary, in the disaster management and the emergency in the situation of emergency, we don't take difference between people. We have a civil protection for everybody. This is that yes, exactly this problem because we don't know where are they and what they are doing in the situation, emergency situation. But exactly this is not problem. We don't. We have a planes from the house where they live, and we exactly we know they are because we have some NGOs and they working for there, and we know about everything. But I think in case of emergency, they will be problem with them because usually they don't want to collaborate with us, and this problem, but not with them. Problems are usually in the people in the case of emergency, But it's very interesting. It's interesting listening from this case because I don't know. We have problem, but not exactly basic problems. I think. So. You understand me?
Yeah.
Because okay.
Would you like to respond?
I don't really have a response. Right now. I'm just trying to kind of, like I said, to kind of think through the ideas and having come to the center. Kind of, I'm new to the emergency field. Like I said, my field or my focus has always been on social rights, and but I think that there is something kind of that this use of the emergency and this idea of emergencies is applied to this area of social welfare, social rights. Has interesting implications for a range of
Okay, we in the case of emergency, we're working together with the social works every time, and also with NGOs because the disaster management is not enough. We have a case like here in Haifa was 2 years ago, but we have to work together. This is civil protection, a little bit. We work together with the police and army and the NGOs and everything who work in the public services and also the social works because they know about that's people, It's very difficult, but okay.
No, interesting.
This is part of the work.
So I have two comments.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one comment is about the body of literature that you are using. There is a kind of increasing literature about what I would call urban sociology of homelessness. I don't know if you know the book by Catherine Beckett and Steve Herbert. It's about Seattle, about zoning in Seattle. And the whole book is actually devoted to the way in which homeless people are being criminalized. I think it was published in 2009. It is using some of Foucault notions of criminalization of homeless people. So my first comment is, are you in fact using that kind of body of literature, which is goes back in a way to sociology of the 19th century about urban development in Europe and criminalization of people, of homeless people. So I suggest that you look into it. And my second comment is actually similar to what Itamar is saying. So on the one hand, I share your suspicion of policymakers, public policy which is utilizing definitions of emergencies. Notwithstanding, I also see its virtues. So in order to make planning more efficient, in order to find more efficient solutions, defining a situation as emergency might have its own advantages. It would have probably also negative ramifications like confiscation of private property. So I think that in a way I'm sharing Itamar's suggestion to look also at the virtues of defining a phenomena as emergency. So those are my 2 comments.
I have 2 little comments. One is that you look at the dangerousness, and part of the dangerousness, I think, is to public safety and health. The homelessness phenomena is seen as something that endangers health in the public space because there's no utilities for their living there. And so I think this is an aspect that you should think about because it's not just the dangerousness for the homeless people, but for the public. And then if you have danger to the public, then the authorities are trying to have more authorizations and power to deal with it, and they have more justification to use extreme measures like making it criminal offenses.
Right.
So this
no,
is
that's fair. It's interesting because and that's why I discussed the idea of kind of the threat or danger and the ambiguity is because there is so many different ways that you can look at the threat or danger. So there are people who have, and they've actually defined, like certain cities have defined the state of emergency in respect of, you know, a lack of shelter space. Some have defined it as, for example, if there's been an outbreak of, you know, hepatitis or some other kind of concern. And then, but then there are certain jurisdictions, and I draw on as an example in the paper, the city of Anaheim, who, if you read kind of their resolution declaring the state of emergency, it very much focuses on, it feeds into kind of the assumptions that I raised. The idea that it focused on the criminality of the homeless populations. It focuses on kind of the people's concerns about property values, and so you're very, you know, you're absolutely right. And so I'm just, that's why I wasn't trying to suggest that it's only a negative and it's only leading in the negative. You know, obviously there are positives, and I think people have recognized those positives, and hopefully that's why they're using them. I just, you know, I'm trying to kind of get my head around, you know, what are those negatives, and that hopefully we can resolve those negatives to make sure that it is being used in only the, you know, the positive direction. But yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
I think the main issue of this lecture is the declaration of emergency, state of emergency. And it seems to me that in no way homelessness should be declared as a state of emergency, because every social problem, if it's homelessness, if it's poverty, if it's other matters, they are dealt within the framework of public policy or political policy. It's not an emergency that you have to declare. Emergency declaration, I think, by doing emergency declaration, you can negate real emergency declaration by the perception of the public. Because if this is an emergency and something else is an emergency, then, you know, זילות של המושג. אני לא יודע איך אומרים זילות באנגלית. אולי, אתה יודע? It can be, in a sense, it's reducing the importance and the imminent reaction that we have to take, because every social problem can be dealt as an emergency. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say is it's a political disguise to a social problem that has to be dealt within social policy or public policy or political policy by the politician, by NGOs, by others. And this is the main, I think, issue here, and not how we are dealing with the problem. Of course, so it's a dialectical, you know, problem. On the one hand, you can govern, you know, resources, etc., etc. But on the other hand, we are reducing the effect, the real meaning of emergency. As you have said before, you have some criteria. What is when we have to declare emergency? If it's sudden, if it's the severity of it, if it's something that we have to react immediately, etc., etc. So this is the issue, and I see the negative side of this rather than the positive side of this. Dealing with housing, I still think that within the article, housing is not a different issue, because if you remember, at the beginning of the 90s, when we have the inflection immigration from Russia, and if I remember correctly, Arik Sharon was the minister of housing.
Yeah.
What it did immediately, without declaring emergency, is to take caravans and other facilities, and as Arik Sharon knows, to cut through all the bureaucratic obstacles. This was an immediate response to a housing problem, a real housing problem, not you know, marginal
But then
thing.
he also
But I
had
think he said-
regulatory changes. He
Yeah, and
also
he
had
said
regulatory
it's an emergency.
And it
When
was
he
not
did
just
it.
an emergency, it was whole
Yeah, he said
Yes,
that. Yeah,
and
exactly.
it was
במובן,
emergency
okay, in
regulatory,
the sense,
I'm not talking about action, but Sharon also had emergency regulatory
he-
changes, and that's what happened now.
okay, but it was not declared as a state of emergency as we know it. It's not, you know,
There is a state of
Yeah,
emergency.
we're in, so you just need to say it's part of it.
Regular.
The regulation
The
was,
regulation was emergency regulation,
Yeah.
which lasted for years and which has now been readopted.
so it's a permanent, it's more permanent.
Since the 50s, it's running since the 50s.
These are in addition.
And it didn't.
But these are.
It's more a permanent emergency situation.
In theory, it's not supposed to be permanent.
If it takes, if it lasts,
Permanent than the temporary.
if it lasts for
Lasts for
years,
70
It
years.
lasts for
so
years.
it's like the military regime
No,
that we
but in
have.
addition to those, you have.
כמו המשטר הצבאי שהיה לו
you have
ממשל צבאי.
these,
There are more layers.
Okay.
So I think that we
okay.
I think that we should not go into trying to differentiate between housing and other matters. I think that the main issue or question is if it's an emergency question or it is a social / political issue. I think it's more a social political issue. We know it lasts for decades. It can be inequality in income, it can be poverty, it can be housing, it can be, you name it.
But then there are socioeconomic breakdowns. I mean,
But it's not an emergency.
well,
It doesn't go into the criteria of emergency.
In legal theory, you think of housing as a different field because there aren't there and there can't be immediate results. Because housing is housing. You want to build a house. I want to regulate mobile phones. I can do it today and it's going to start tomorrow. If I want to build a house, it's going to take me 3 years.
But you have to go out of the
That's why
box.
it's different.
No, but you have to go out of the box. You can put, as it was in the 50s, tenants. Why housing? Why housing? You can put tents. You can put.
But in the 50s, they did both. That's exactly the point. This is why housing is different. Because when you want to regulate housing or when you want to do like this solution for housing, the question is why do you need emergency? Because you need long-term solution. You can put tents and you can put caravans and you can do all that. But for permanent or long-term solutions for large populations, when you have immigration waves, and when you have a huge growing problem of homelessness, you need to take under consideration at least 3 or 4 or 5 years. And that's what makes housing different when we think of emergencies or regulation. It can't give immediate results.
But emergency should have an immediate,
That's the
more or
point,
less.
exactly.
So tenants can be a question, and housing is for the midterm or long term. Emergency, it's like a fire. You have to diminish it.
And that's the thing about housing.
No, that's the thing about tenants.
Worldwide, many of the reforms in housing were very intensely politicized.
Politicized.
Yes, yes.
And politicians implemented short-term solutions.
This is
So-
what's happening now.
And that's the
All
thing.
ההסכמי הגג.
סליחה?
יש עכשיו,
Roof agreements.
I don't know how to,
לא הבנתי.
מה זה הסכמי גג?
It's agreements with the local authorities, so the government gives money for the local authorities to build more houses.
To triple their size without infrastructure.
Okay.
These are things that are not allowed usually, so they use,
But so it's not emergency.
well, but they.
It's not an emergency.
But they define it as an emergency. It's defined.
And that's-
So it's a political definition.
Yes, it is.
Okay,
That's
okay,
the
so
It is.
Homelessness too.
okay,
So
but
it gives you immediate
on the other
results.
hand, אני חוזר לזילות, it reduces
Absolutely.
other matters that
Absolutely.
devote the reaction or the declaration. It's a really
And
And
it's-
it's power.
And it's not a long-term solution. That's the thing about housing. The politicians come and go and governments come and go and they want to present to the public
But
immediate solutions, and they can't when it comes to housing.
But it's interesting that you raise this point because it's actually one of the things I didn't get a chance to cover and I want to cover. But my other concern with it is this idea of urgency, and it's like it pushes you towards the short term rather than the long term.
Exactly.
And most of the research dealing with housing and the right to housing establishes that you need to focus on the long term.
And there are no accelerations for
exactly.
arguments.
And so that's part of my
Yeah.
concern with not only are you dealing with these criminalization measures, and that's why in terms of more broadly
Then I look
regressive,
beyond
but
4
exactly.
years. That's not
Yeah.
my.
And by the way, New York went back the other way. I mean, that's exactly it. It was a short-term solution, very
And
drastic, and it hasn't changed.
And in New York, you have historical remainings of serious house regulations, which I'm not sure LA has got. It's interesting to check. In New York, there are
It's
very
very-
extensive housing with very low rent, like rent control from in Berlin,
of course,
New York.
Yeah.
Oh,
go ahead.
Just a little question that you said visible homelessness.
Yes.
So what about the invisible homelessness? Because if I think about emergency, so I think that they would like to to find a solution to all the homelessness. But if you think only the visible one, so for me it's like it feels really political and not about the human rights.
No, you're absolutely right, and it goes kind of with the issue of defining the ambiguity, because and I raised the point in the paper that when you're dealing with homelessness, it's so much broader than visible homelessness. But most of the time, when you're dealing with these states of emergency, these declarations, the focus by and large is on visible homelessness, and that militates towards focusing on kind of that idea of the target being the non-homeless, the state. It just kind of feeds into this kind of cycle. But you're absolutely right, and that's why. And over the long-term solutions, because if you're only focusing on the visible homeless, so it's just kind of a self-perpetuating cycle. But you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
בבקשה.
I'm wondering how does this conversation intersect with issues of race, especially since your emphasis on criminalization is so central. In the United States, it would seem that there's some overlap between this conversation and the conversation surrounding mass incarceration as a new kind of mode of segregation or Jim Crow or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, to be honest, I haven't thought that much about kind of the intersection with race, but it's a good point. Like even like working within kind of, because my kind of focus or my interest is in Canada, being Canadian, but and a disproportionate number of the homeless population in Canada are members of the Indigenous communities. They're disproportionately overrepresented, as are LGBT, particularly the youth. So there's a bunch of intersections with different kind of areas, but yeah, I haven't actually.
I think in as much as LA and other U.S. cities are at the center of the paper, it's a major issue.
No, thanks. Yeah.
Okay. One of the criterions to emergency declaration is something that is hidden and has a sudden effect. I think that looking at the cyber problem, this by itself, I think undermines this criterion, because we all know that we are, dealing within a cyberspace, and we know that it can be now, it can be in 24 hours, it can be in 1 hour, and still we are not, declaring any emergency declaration. So I think that this criterion was good criterion pre-cyber problem. Now that we are, operating, or living within this cyber environment, I think that we have to look again and check if this criterion still is, viable.
Any more comments?
Well, we have an online question
Okay.
I'm sorry, I have to go. The minibus leaves at 4.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, Maya.
Have a good day. Bye.
Maya is a very housing.
It's much more.
Nadav is watching us online. So he sent a question. Emergency and or governance. Following Maya's question, it is still not clear how and why homelessness is or can be an emergency in the regular sense. Authorization to act is required for every governmental action, regardless of emergency, the principle of legality, or at least clear and express authorization to interfere with rights. What is special then in homelessness or the power to deal with homelessness? That's one question. And the other one is the relevant unit, local emergency. Your argument raised interesting questions regarding the entity in which states of emergency may exist. For example, there may be a homelessness crisis in Toronto, but it is definitely not national emergency, Ontario, Canada. Where is the emergency then? And what are its characteristics compared with national or regional emergencies?
I missed the second question.
The assumption that there are no local emergencies.
Yeah, it says, the question is about the relevant unit of local emergency. So it says, regarding the entity in which states of emergency may exist. If there may be homelessness crisis in Toronto, but it's not national. And then it says, where is the emergency then, and what are its characteristics compared with national or regional emergencies?
Well, I guess to start with the second question, like the reason I'm focusing on the local state of emergency is because that's so far, based on my research, where states of emergency have been declared on homelessness, and they've been using local legislation. So even in, for example, to my example, Toronto, you would have to use Ontario legislation and Toronto regulations that deal with this issue. There's nothing to say that you couldn't declare, I guess, a national emergency in respect of homelessness if it were, you know, and to some extent it would help the local governments kind of get that federal support. But yeah, I guess that's why I'm focusing on the local kind of state of emergency, and if that makes sense. But in terms of his first question, I don't know if I'm necessarily arguing that homelessness is somehow special. I'm trying to kind of, there's been literature that deals with other areas of states of emergency, but this new, and as the point has been made quite rightly, the state of emergency is being applied more and more to new areas, and homelessness just happens to be the new, or one of the new kind of ones that outside of the typical national disaster, national security, economic crisis, and homelessness doesn't really fit into any of those. Some have said that it could be, you know, seen as a public health crisis, for example, but depending on whether or not you actually declare it in respect of, you know, that public health crisis. So yeah, I guess I'm not really thinking in terms of what makes it unique, but I think it feeds into kind of the literature on this criminalization. I think that, so to the extent that there is a large body of literature dealing with the criminalization of homelessness. So I'm just trying to see and to kind of consider and expand upon this, the relationship between homelessness and the state of emergency on homelessness, and this push towards the criminalization of homelessness.
Yes, the question is about governance. Once you declare a state of emergency, you have different powers to govern.
Right.
So the question is homelessness different from other emergencies in this respect?
Well, you'd essentially be subject to the same legislation. So like but then you have issues about whether or not, like, so there's this standing issue about whether or not it's even constitutional to criminalize homelessness, and that has been challenged, and in some jurisdictions it's been held unconstitutional, to the best of my knowledge. And I know, like, I think as of this week, there's legislation in Canada or in Ontario that criminalizes homelessness to a certain extent. It's called the Safe Streets Act, and it's just been challenged. So it's not to say that, you know, the state of emergency protects it. It just, or it prevents those issues from being raised. But like the Safe Streets Act was introduced in 1999, and it's just now that it's being like it's been for a long time, people have kind of questioned its import. And I somewhat, and I can't kind of draw any definitive conclusion, but interestingly enough, the Safe Streets Act was introduced just after Toronto. They didn't declare a state of emergency on homelessness, but they declared homelessness a natural disaster. And within a kind of, I think it was within the same year, they introduced the Safe Streets Act. So obviously I can't draw any kind of conclusion from that, but I think it's an interesting parallel.
Maybe one thing. What do you think? This is humanitarian problem or emergency? Case of emergency. I think this is different. Because first of all, I think this is humanitarian problems, and they need humanitarian help. I think this is the first thing. And after we can speak about this is case of emergency for the government, for the public. So this is not a question. But first of all, I think it's humanitarian problems. Because in the Hungary, this very big problem, this immigration from the Syria and from the other places. Because we closed the southern borders. And we give first of all humanitarian help for these people, and after that we thinking about it. They are emergency for not for the Hungary, for the European Union and the European states. And first of all, I think this is humanitarian problems because they have disease, because they have medical conditions and the others.
No, I think that
and for also the homeless people, first of all, the humanitarian problems, because they don't need nothing. They live on the streets and they don't get medical help. They don't.
No, I think there's many ways to look at it. I guess it's just a question of whether or not this, and it's not to say that the emergency response is the best response or the right response, or it just is a response. And so to the extent that it's being used, we have to kind of think about
after that it will be a huge problem. This is a case of emergency.
But I think even the municipalities that have turned and the states that have turned to the, I don't think they would necessarily see it as the ideal solution to kind of problems with this, but it's being seen as kind of a necessary action. And so I just, to the extent that it's being used, kind of, I think it's important to kind of consider its ramifications. But yeah, you're right.
More comments? Thanks very much.
Thank you.